So, the existence of God. That's the topic I have settled on for this week. So I want to start by trying to define terms a bit. And this is not easy to do when it comes to defining God. So what does one mean by God when one says that? You ask an evangelical Christian in the US, they're probably going to say something like Jesus, or, he's the creator of, the universe. He spoke it into existence. Something very similar to that. And even though it's debatable whether the Trinity is in actuality an example of monotheism, the Christians will claim that is monotheism, that God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit are all part of the same being, even though they're distinct somehow. And we're just told that that's a mystery. That's what I was told growing up. That's a very rudimentary explanation, obviously, of the Christian concept of God. But more or less, it's a Trinitarian version of monotheism. You have something like Islam is more a pure monotheism. Like literally, Allah is the only God. He doesn't have a son. There are no demigods, as far as I know. They do have the equivalent, from what I understand, they're of angels in their religion, but there are no other gods but Allah. Allah is the only one who exists. Let me preface that by saying I'm not an expert on Islam by any means. That's my understanding of their view of God, that Allah is the only God, literally the only God. There is no spirit of Allah, there's no son of Allah, it's just Allah, that's it. It's probably the Judaism, and maybe to be more specific, Orthodox Judaism, if you want to talk about modern Judaism. Orthodox Judaism would also be monotheistic in that they would teach that Yahweh is the one true God and there is none besides him. The Shema, I am the Lord your God. There are none others beside me. Now, if you look at historical Judaism, it's a little messier, and this is not just based on my own observations. This is coming from other scholars as well. Peter Enns, for instance, proposes, and it's not original with him either, but I've heard him talking about this topic, that what you see more of in the Old Testament is monolatry. In other words, to define that, that means the worship of only one God. In other words, our God is the only one worth worshiping. The other gods do exist, but our God is more powerful. He's the supreme God. He's the only God worth worshiping. In a sense, it's kind of like taking the chief god of a pantheon. For instance, in the Ugaritic religion, the god El is the head of the pantheon. I think he's viewed as the creator, more or less. Not necessarily the direct creator of all things, but kind of the originator, and he creates some of the other gods who are involved to a lesser extent in creation. Honestly, it's a little bit like Christianity in a sense, where Yahweh is pictured as the creator. Well, actually, to be more specific, the name used is Elohim, which could be a derivative of El, or the Council of El. Like Elohim literally means the gods, from what I understand. It's like the plural form, so that could be an old reference to the Divine Council of El, which would indicate that there's some Ugaritic influence on Judaism, which would certainly be a tenable hypothesis. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit. So there's different views of God. There's different concepts. Then you have pantheism, obviously. Now again, I'm not an expert on pantheism, but to sum up my understanding of it, essentially the universe is God. In a sense, the universe is a living organism, and we are all a part of that organism. So in a sense, we are all God, and the universe is God, and it's all interconnected. It's one living entity, if you will. At least that's my understanding of pantheism. I know even less about the term panentheism, and I couldn't tell you how to distinguish between the two, but essentially the idea of, as I understand it, God is the universe. So all of us are a part of God, a part of this massive living organism. And it's all interconnected. And if you think of it like an organism, it would make sense why elements of the organism would be able to communicate with each other, say across long distances, for instance. Like, it might explain some of what is attributed to lesser deities in other religions, like demons, angels, etc., by saying, well, this is all living organisms, so of course there would be communication, just like in the human body you have communication through the nervous system. Our human body is in a sense, a collective organism. I think of my body, in a sense, it is I don't even know what the right term would be, a symbiotic unit, if you will. It is a complex organism that is made up of a lot of less complex organisms that work in concert with one another to help this organism I call my body to function. Now, there are parameters for it, obviously, like I have my skin, which holds in like my internal organs, my muscles, like my blood, etc. So there's a physical limitation to that, but within this thing called my body, there are a lot of smaller living and functioning organisms, including bacteria, which can live outside of my body as well. Now they need some kind of they're symbiotic organisms. They need some type of organic matter or organic being in order to survive, because they survive symbiotically, but they live within me. Even my cells, like each cell has, in a sense, its own brain, if you will. It has the ability to follow and process information. You have the nucleus of the cell, which gives instructions. This is just demonstrating a very rudimentary knowledge of microbiology, which is a fascinating subject. I haven't studied it in depth in quite a while, but it's just fascinating to me. Like you have encoded in here like information for the building of proteins, for instance. It's fascinating, and like how it all works together. And sometimes it doesn't work together very well, but more often than not, it works together in an amazing way. And so pantheism would kind of be the proposition that maybe the entire universe is like one massive body, and we're all a part of it. So that's just an idea. That one, frankly, is very intriguing to me. More intriguing presently than the idea of a kind of... Now, this description comes from some lectures I've heard Richard Carrier give, but it's kind of a way of stepping outside of the religious way of thinking about God and looking at it, if you will, objectively for a minute. And I don't mean objectively in the purest sense of the word, but like kind of looking at it as if you're an outsider to it. So think about what the nature of this being that So let's say God the Father from the Christian perspective, or Yahweh, if you will. Generally speaking, the Bible says in certain, I forget the reference, but it says God is spirit, right? And if you look at the way his mind operates, it's similar to our own, which, within Christian teaching, that is somewhat consistent, because supposedly we're made in the image of God. But obviously our physical bodies are not made in his image, because he didn't have one, at least not until he decided to become a man in the form of Jesus, right? But from time immemorial in the past, he didn't have a body, so that's not the way in which we're made in his image. So it has more to do with our mind, our spirit, according to Christian theology. But let's just focus on mind for right now. So God is spirit. It could mean in a sense he exists in a dimension that is outside, both outside and inside of our own, in some mysterious sense. But in terms of how, as a being, he operates, looking at it from our perspective, he is a bodiless mind, which, when we look around at what we can observe with our senses, especially in modern day with our scientific understanding of the world, you don't really see bodiless minds just like walking around. And even if you saw the effects of a bodiless mind, like, I guess if it were to exist in the real universe, there needs to be some way to observe it, right? You would think. It may just be we don't have the technology to detect that operation at this point. But with our normal senses, like we don't see that operating. And yet the being, he still has emotions. This is obviously from the I'm going to use this term, Judeo-Christian perspective. In other words, like take the Jewish scriptures, you take the Christian scriptures, which in reality were all written by Jews with maybe a couple of exceptions, but the Jewish scriptures, essentially, Jewish writings. He's the creator of all things, right? And yet he is spirit. He's not made of, it's at least not in a way that the Bible describes. Like, he's not made of matter and energy himself, but rather is separate from it and brought matter and energy into being by speaking. So in a sense, by using his mind. But he didn't actually have lips. Didn't literally have lips. So it was more like telepathic communication, except without a brain, because his brain is somehow either spiritual or it's extra dimensional. It exists in another dimension somehow that we can't see or easily detect. So we're left with kind of the same place the ancients were when they looked at the wind, for instance. Like, if you look behind me close enough, you can probably see some branches swaying. And to the naked eye, unless there's some particulates being blown around, like, the wind is invisible, right? But you see the effects of it. So that's the best we could do. If we're going to posit that God is like an invisible, to our normal senses, invisible, bodiless mind, the only thing we could do to prove or disprove his existence is by looking at what we perceive to be the effects of this mind's, actions or thoughts. And maybe for him, a thought is an action in the purest sense, because he doesn't have, or didn't in the past anyway. I know Jesus sort of, it's complicated. Jesus does have a body according to Orthodox Christian teaching. So God kind of does have a body now, and yet at the same time he doesn't, because he can still go everywhere and be everywhere, both inside and outside of our dimension. So it gets some pretty trippy stuff, So what's the probability that being exists and that this being has benevolent intentions in the way that we as humans normally understand benevolence or kindness or generosity? In other words, his intentions for us is health and wellness, long life, etc. And you see that borne out in the Old Testament especially. Like, you look at the list of blessings that Yahweh promises to Israel. Most of it's like health and long life. Health, possessions, long life. So that is how they viewed his benevolence, his blessing, if you will. His cursing is basically the opposite of those things, taking away their possessions, giving them diseases, and ultimately, death. And perhaps a shortened lifespan because of their wickedness, supposedly. But yeah, so that is, when you look, particularly, like I said, when you get to the New Testament, it's a little different. It's kind of like, I think the blessings are shifted, if you will, from this life to more of the afterlife, which there's not a clear concept of the afterlife in the Old Testament, but when you get the New Testament, that begins to be developed more cogently, more clearly, that concept. And obviously, as you've gone through Christian history, theologians have developed that concept even more. But you do see it introduced in the New Testament. and as well as in some of the Jewish writings that predate the New Testament, the intertestamental writings, if you want to call them that. Again, this is coming from a Christian perspective. So it gets even tougher from a New Testament perspective to prove that this God is actually benevolent, because now you have an explanation for why even when you're trying to love and serve this God and trust him, you still can have a shitty life. It's like, well, maybe God's just deferring your blessings, but you're going to get them in the afterlife. Whereas before, Jews didn't really believe in an afterlife. Like you go to the grave, you go to Sheol, which might have been, depending on the writer and the period, might have been something like the Greek idea of Hades, where there's this shadowy realm of like half existence, shadow existence, where everybody goes, good or bad. There's no judgment that sends you to one place or the other. Everybody goes to the same place. It's like the shadow realm. You're like a bunch of ghosts living underneath the earth in the underworld. That kind of idea. Like there's some indications that Jews believe Sheol was something like that. But you also have this concept of, you see this in Ecclesiastes, like you live, you die, you go to the grave, that's it. Your life is like a blade of grass that's here today and tomorrow is burned up in the fire, and that's it. But the New Testament, you get this clearer idea of the afterlife, and testing God's benevolence, then you try to extend it further out. So it's like deferred benevolence. So then it almost gets impossible then to prove, because if you trust in Jesus and you're following him, and he does seem to say that a little bit. He's like, you follow me, you're probably going to have a shitty life. You're going to get persecuted. You're going to face hardship. And I think obviously the Jews had experienced that enough over the years, those that tried to maintain their orthodox beliefs in the face of like attempts by the Greeks to Hellenize them, or the Romans. The Romans were okay with you practicing religion as long as you didn't creep towards anything they viewed as seditious, and as long as you didn't start going around trying to teach that all their gods are fake, in other words, trying to convert everybody to monotheism, or to your God, and saying all their deities are false. As long as you didn't do that kind of stuff, they're okay with letting you worship your own God for the most part. Anyway, Jews have been oppressed for a long time, so they realize like we're not always getting the blessings Yahweh promised us, even when we're trying to be obedient and trust him. So maybe those blessings are just being deferred to the afterlife. Well, now, from our limited perspective here on this plane, if you will, in this dimension, so now we can't prove that God's good at all, because for many people, those blessings can just be deferred to the afterlife, and you can have a shitty life until you get to the afterlife. Sorry, buddy. That was God's plan for you. But then that begs the question, like, how do you know he's actually good? How do you test whether this being is benevolent? And even if circumstances in your life go well, how do you know he's the one responsible? Like, how do you prove that? How do you test that? And that's where it gets tough. And at the end of the day, you're kind of just told, well, faith is the evidence of things hoped for. It's like the hope of things not seen. And I'm probably misquoting that, but it's in Hebrews chapter 11. But basically, at the end of the day, you just have to trust. You have to trust that God is going to be good, even if he's not seeming to be benevolent now, because your life sucks and he seems to be silent. He's going to reward you in the afterlife, so just stick with it, hold to it, stay the course, and eventually you'll be rewarded. That's kind of the idea. Again, as I said, that's in contrast to the Old Testament perspective, where the blessings of God, they thought, should be evident in this life. And that's what God essentially said. So they're left, the only explanation is either God isn't benevolent, or it's our fault because we didn't do a good enough job keeping the law. We didn't trust him enough. Therefore, it's all fault. Those are kind of the two, usually they default to that, because the alternative is believing either their God is too weak to accomplish his promises, or he doesn't actually exist, which I don't even know if that would have been an option back then so much. They might have gone and served another God, which you do see evidence of in Jewish history, for sure, like people serving Baal, because maybe they notice, well, Yahweh doesn't seem to be helping me, maybe Baal will, or El, or Asherah, or, etc., or Marduk, what have you. So those are tough questions, like, how do we prove God's existence? So this is just my initial thoughts on it, kind of a little background information. So I'm going to call this part 1. I'll do a part 2, probably post them both this weekend, get it a little bit more into some of the technical sides of it, and share some of my personal thoughts and emotions about the topic as well, because it does hit very personal for me, as it does for most people, I think. So with that, I will sign off for now.